Hey, Todd here, back with askdrtk. And one of the most popular questions I get is, how do I get started in hybrid mixing when I have a fairly basic audio interface? And it doesn't matter so much whether it's expensive or a cheaper model, the answer is pretty similar. So let's talk about it. So when we talk about hybrid mixing, what we really mean is we're mixing in the box, so in our DAW and on the computer, and we want the ability to insert analog gear on one or more buses or tracks in the mix. Now, why would we want to do that? Plugins have become very good, and there's no reason why you can't get great results using plugins when you're producing music. But analog gear, in my opinion, imparts a certain tone and character that it's very difficult to duplicate with plugins only. After all, there are transformers, tubes, and other analog circuitry that all interact with one another, and it even varies by program material going through, and this is why it's so difficult to duplicate perfectly with plugins. Now, if you're wondering what specific analog gear you should get to start with hybrid mixing, I have a number of videos about that. But today I want to take a look at the connections. What do we need to actually use that gear? And at a minimum, we need an audio interface that has inputs and outputs that are not in use. So for example, on this Scarlett 4i4, we have 4 outputs. That means 2 of them will be used for my studio monitors, and the other 2 are available to send audio out to the analog gear. It also has 2 additional line inputs that allow us to bring that audio back. And that's an important place to start, and it'll allow us to actually place an effect across our 2-bus, whether it be a compressor, EQ, or otherwise, so we could get started there. But what I really recommend is an interface that has at least 8 inputs and outputs. That'll give you some flexibility to get started. And beyond that, it's actually important if you're buying a new interface to consider one that has expandability, whether it's ADAT or otherwise, because once you get started with analog gear, you may find that you need more channels than are available on an interface with 8 ins and 8 outs in the analog domain. Now, to start with a minimal setup, if your audio interface has at least one set of outputs and inputs that are not in use, I recommend placing your analog gear on the 2-bus or master bus. That way it can impact every aspect of your mix. Now, there's a variety of ways to do this, and there's quite some debate around it. There are specialty color boxes like the SSL Fusion. Some people prefer to put 2 preamps on their master bus. You can use bus compressors, EQs. Really, the sky's the limit. You'll often hear me recommend placing a pair of mic pre's on your master bus, and I really recommend that because if it's your first analog gear, it also gives you something you can use for other applications. So it's not an analog gear that has only one purpose. But definitely the sky's the limit. There's a lot you can use. Also in this configuration, there's nothing to stop you from using that analog gear on individual tracks. So if you do go with preamps or compressors, you can go ahead and apply those on your snare drum, bass, vocals, a lot of options there too. But again, generally the most impact is going to come from the 2-bus. Now, if you're just getting into hybrid mixing and you need to upgrade your audio interface, I recommend getting something that has at least 8 analog inputs and outputs. This is going to give you some flexibility. Remember, outputs 1 and 2 are generally going to be your studio monitors, so that's going to leave you with 6 outputs for analog gear. And we can get a lot done with that. Some ideas might be to, again, have 2 channels dedicated to your master or 2-bus. And so again, whether that's a color box, 2 preamps, bus compressor, you can do whatever you like there, but that leaves you 4 additional pairs of inputs and outputs. So you can get a pair of 1176 compressors, an LA2A optical compressor, and a Pultec EQ. That way you have a number of devices you can use on individual tracks, again, like snare drums, vocals, bass guitar. You can get a lot done that way. Now, one way to get more out of the available I/O on our audio interface is to daisy chain our analog gear. Now, I only recommend this if you have gear that's always going to be used in one way. So for example, if we had a color box like an SSL Fusion, and we then wanted to add up a bus compressor after that, we could go ahead and do that, still using only 2 outputs and inputs from our audio interface. We could even go ahead and add up additional EQ, like a pair of Pultecs, all again on those 2 inputs and outputs. That leaves us a lot more room for other gear for tracks. Now, that can be an issue if we want to move them and use them for other things, but certainly it's a good way to get started again if we want to add a little more gear and we're not ready to upgrade our audio interface. Now, once we've made use of the available analog inputs and outputs on our audio interface, and we've done whatever daisy chaining makes sense, there's a number of options to move forward with expansion. Now, the least expensive is generally to add a Patchbay, and that allows us to add additional outboard gear and patch that into the inputs and outputs on our audio interface and create additional daisy chains. We can't use them all at once, but we can at least mix and match them as we like. Now, the next option is to actually expand the number of inputs and outputs on the interface itself. And if we go back to what I said initially about getting an interface that has some expandability, that could mean ADAT or it could mean aggregate devices. And so if we're able to add another 8 or 16 channels of I/O, right away we have a lot more options for expansion. And of course we can combine that with the Patchbay to really give us the opportunity to add a lot of analog gear and mix and match it in and out of our mixing session as we need to. And depending on your audio interface, once we start getting beyond channel counts of 16 and 24, there are a number of other protocols we can look at like Dante and MADI that make it really efficient to get high channel counts. Beyond the scope of this video, but they're certainly available. So whether you're starting out with 2 channels of analog gear on your master bus, or you have additional I/O available to deploy across your mix, hybrid mixing is a great way to get that analog vibe and sound and still enjoy the convenience of your DAW. And of course, if you're just getting started setting up your music PC or looking for that first piece of analog gear, check out one of these videos. As always, thanks for watching. Really appreciate you joining me, and I'll see you next time.